So as we know, today is Palm Sunday. So I've taken Matthew's version of the procession into Jerusalem. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, and they placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." These are words inspired by God. So today, Palm Sunday, and next week, God willing, Easter Sunday, I'm going to be looking at the last week of Jesus' earth life. Maggie Thatcher said famously one time, she said, "A week is a long time in politics because so many things can happen with huge consequences." I believe that the last week of Jesus' life had more effect on the planet than all of the politicians throughout all of human history. And so I'm going to cover some of that today, and the next Sunday I look at the resurrection. So today then I want to look at 4 parts of this last week in Jesus' life. The first part I want to look at, I'm going to look at the story of the Transfiguration, and then I'm going to look at Palm Sunday. Then thirdly, I want to look at Holy Thursday, and then fourthly, I want to look at Good Friday. So what's the story about Transfiguration? In the last week of his life, Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter and James and John, up onto the top of Mount Tabor. And Mount Tabor is in Lower Galilee, and it's an elevation of 1,866 feet. So we wouldn't really regard it as a great mountain, but they labor to the top of the mountain. And for me, it feels when I read this story as if Jesus is having a kind of I describe it as a dress rehearsal for resurrection. Because when you read the story, Moses and Elijah appear to him, and Jesus' entire body changes. It becomes a light body. And it's fascinating to me to learn scientifically that if you look at the human body, we have about 70 trillion cells, and every cell is composed of photons of light. If you could release all the photons of light in a single human body, you could light up a baseball stadium at 1 million watts for 3.5 hours. That's how much light is actually locked into the physical human body. And so somehow when this gets released, as in I believe the resurrection, and in this story, in the Transfiguration, we hear that his entire countenance shone, even as his garments picked up on the radiation of the light coming from him. So for me, it was like a dress rehearsal. A week before he died, and a week before his resurrection, he's doing a dress rehearsal. And he becomes a time traveler in this. And so Moses and Elijah appear to him. Now, Moses putatively lived about around the year 1250 BCE, before the Common Era, and Elijah lived about 850 years before the Common Era. And they appear because they're archetypes. Moses is the archetype of Torah, of the law, and he's the liberator par excellence. And Moses was on another mountain when he received the covenant. He was on top of Mount Sinai. And then you have Elijah. There's a famous story about Elijah on another mountain called Mount Carmel. And the prophet, the call of the prophet is not so much to predict the future, but to prevent the future. It is to call us back into our covenanted relationship with God. But for the the Hebrews and for the Jews at the time, Moses and Elijah represented the entire scriptural tradition. So the Sadducees did not believe in what were called the writings. The Pharisees did, but not the Sadducees. So for the Pharisees, there are three parts to the scripture. And there's an acronym called Tanakh, T standing for Torah, N standing for Nebiim, which means the prophets, and K standing for Ketubim, which were the writings. Now the Sadducees only accepted two. They accepted the law and the prophets. So here's Jesus, in some senses, revisiting the entire scriptural tradition of his own people, the law and the prophets. Now, the issue I have with both Moses and Elijah was that they were both extraordinarily violent men, responsible for the death of hundreds of people. But they were people of their times. So Jesus brings a whole new understanding of the mission of Judaism and the mission of spirituality and mysticism in general. So now Jesus, in this week of his life particularly, is going to liberate spirituality from mere man-made religions. He's going to turn legalism into love. He's going to turn violence into forgiveness. He's going to turn a punitive, distant, demanding deity into a gentle, loving Abba. So when I think of the Transfiguration, that's what I think. It's like Jesus doing a dress rehearsal, getting ready for this final phase of his mission. So that's what I would say about the Transfiguration. When I think then of the story of Palm Sunday, the one we've just read from Matthew's Gospel, the backstory is this, that every Passover, the Roman governor, who in this instance was Pilate, would march in through the western gate of Jerusalem on his war horse, leading heavily armed troops from Caesarea Philippi, which was on the coast. And he would take up occupation in Jerusalem of the fortress Antonia, which directly overlooked the temple courtyard, in order to keep an eye on the restive Jews. Because Judaism at this stage, on this feast, is celebrating their release from another empire, the Egyptian Empire, and an exodus from Egypt into Israel. And so at this stage, the Romans are really, really scared of any kind of a revolution. So for the duration of the feast then, the population of Jerusalem typically at that stage was about 40,000 people. But everybody came down for the feast from all over, from the Galilee and other parts, and from Samaria. And the population would swell from about 40,000 people to 1.5 million. So you had this huge, big, tented slum city surrounding Jerusalem. And as you can imagine, this made the Romans really, really nervous. So they came in every time with a great display showcasing their military might. Now, at the other side, the other bookend to this was, here comes Jesus riding on a borrowed donkey in a simple, seamless tunic, which was woven by his mother. And he comes in through the eastern gate, the other side of Jerusalem, and he's accompanied not by war chargers and military men, but by a disorganized, noisy crowd whose only weapons are palm branches. So there's this extraordinary difference between the might of arms and the might of soul. Now, I believe that Jesus was very comfortable around donkeys. And it's interesting to me that donkeys were like the two bookends of his life. There's the story we heard of that as a little infant, as a little boy before age 2, the family have to fly into Egypt riding on a donkey so that the child can escape death, because Herod is trying to kill all the boy children in Bethlehem and the surrounding areas of 2 years old or less. And now here he is at the other end of his life, processing into Jerusalem on another donkey. The first safari was escaping death. This one is about embracing death, because he knew, this is how it was going to end. There was no other way. Given the times in which he lived, the Roman occupation and the message he was preaching, it was almost inevitable that he was going to wind up dead. So that's what I think of when I think of Palm Sunday every year. And then I think of Holy Thursday, where allegedly, according to the eviscerated scriptures, that only the male disciples were present. There is no bloody way you're going to have a Seder meal without women at it, any more than you have a Christmas gathering without mothers at it. So the The Last Supper is not just an affair of Jesus and 12 male disciples. It is a gathering of all the important people in his life, especially the women. In fact, the women are more important because they're very probably organizing it and cooking the food. Now, they have to be left out of the final versions of the scriptures because during the Last Supper, Jesus ordained everybody present when he said, "Do this in memory of me." Having said, "This is my body, this is my blood," and then he says, "Do this in memory of me." So he was ordaining everybody who was present. So you had to leave the women out. Otherwise, you'd have to have women ordained as priests. Now, during that last meal, I believe that there are 3 different sacraments that were being celebrated. The first one is the sacrament of the Eucharist. And I've said this to you many times, that Eucharist is the most important feminine kind of symbol that Christ could have given us. Of all the signs he could have left us with, or of all the symbols, or of all the sacraments, he chose an extraordinary feminine version. He said, "This is my body." He's going to feed us from his body and from his blood, which is precisely what a woman does. She conceives life in her own body. She carries life in her own body. She births life from her own body. And then she feeds life, the young baby, at her own breast. And so this is the sacrament par excellence of the feminine face of God. Now, I believe then that there's a kind of a code built into Eucharist. There are 4 words which are hugely important. And whenever you find these 4 words in the life of Jesus, it's a Eucharistic encounter, even if it doesn't appear to be. And the 4 codes are: he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. Taking is receiving with gratitude from God. Blessing is not the imparting of a kind of a benediction to a previously inert substance. It is the recognition of the inherent sanctity of everything that Gaia has given us. And then he broke it. He's forming the intention to share the resources of the planet with everybody. And then fourthly, he distributed, walking the talk. And this is the symbol of Eucharist wherever you find it. Wherever you find people taking with gratitude what the earth has to give, blessing what they have by recognizing that it is blessed, by breaking it in order to create models of distribution of our resources, and then walking the talk by distributing them. So for me, that's what the sacrament of Eucharist involves. And I just want to add one thing to the reading that Michael did this morning for us, that we think sometimes that when the priest puts a host on somebody's tongue and says, "the body of Christ," that somehow this kind of thinking that would think that now on your tongue is the total body of Jesus. There's a leg there, there's a kidney there, his eyebrows are there. It is the kind of the movement of the mind, the movement of the soul that creates the divine encounter. And I've used the example many times. If I'm giving communion as a priest and a young kid comes up with a piece of chewing gum in his mouth and he's chewing on one side of his mouth and he's sits on his tongue and I put a host in it, all that happens is the kid goes back to a seat with chewing gum and a piece of bread. If somebody comes up and they're obviously in a devotional state and they understand what's happening and I put the host on her tongue, it is I believe, her faith that transforms it into a real encounter with the risen Christ. So have to be really, really careful not to take these things so kind of literally that we miss the entire mystical intent and possibilities resident in Eucharist. So that was the first sacrament he created. The second one was the creation of the sacrament of priesthood. In most traditions, there's a designated priesthood, and it's either in a kind of a lineage of some kind or there's an ordination ceremony of some kind. I do not believe that that's the case. I believe that there are 4 stages to priesthood, or 4 stages to any ministry, whether it's a bishop or a kind of a lector on a Sunday. And the 4 stages are: there's a need in the community, number 1. Secondly, there's a volunteer that says, "I will address that need." The third part is the person is giving the training to do that. And the fourth part is they're commissioned by the community to act in that capacity in their stead. And so wherever there's a need in a community, and there are volunteers who step forward, and they're given the training, and they're commissioned by the group, there you have priesthood, and there you have ministry. It doesn't belong to people on whom bishops impose their hands and anointed them with oil. That's only one form of it. That was the second sacrament, I believe, at the Last Supper. And the third one, I call it the washing of the feet. I call it the sacrament of service. And we see this again and again and again throughout Christian history, where people understood the full meaning of sacraments. This sacrament of service, we've seen very, very different versions of it. So there were groups of monks and groups of nuns, for instance, who dedicated themselves to the education of little children or high school children or even universities. The great universities of Europe going back to the 1300s were founded by monastic orders. And so the sacrament of service comes out as education. It comes out as well as healing. Again, particularly the sisters of various kinds have created these healing possibilities, hospitals of various kinds. Hospice is a sacrament of service. Agriculture is a sacrament of service. And again, it was the monks in Europe who revised agriculture and made it available so that people, could grow their own foods. So a hugely important sacrament of service is the various ways in which we look at the needs of the world and then we respond to them. So there were the three sacraments, I believe, that Jesus gave us at the Last Supper. And then he proceeds into the Garden of Gethsemane. And he has what I've described in the past as the mother of all panic attacks. Such anxiety that he was literally sweating blood. And I believe that this was a kind of a psyops by Satan. Satan was trying to gaslight him and tell him, you've been duped. There is no Father. There is no God. You've wasted your life. You're going to be a corpse this time tomorrow. Get the hell out of Dodge while you have a time. No, it's the second last temptation to which Jesus will be subjected. Next day, actually on the cross, Satan will come back for one last time. And Christ will cry out in agony, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you abandoned me? But it's interesting that in the garden, in the middle of his own agony, when he finally says, Father, if it's possible, let this chalice pass from me. Isn't there some other way I can fulfill the mission? And then finally he says, not my will, but thine be done. And then the soldiers come to grab him. And even at the end, he's protecting his own. Even those who abandoned him and denied him and betrayed him, he said to the soldiers, you came for me, let these other men go. And so even at the end, before he's crucified, in some senses, he's sacrificing himself. And the final part of the week I want to deal with today is look at the Good Friday story. And I believe that good liturgy is like the ritualization of a story. So I spent a few years in a mission called Kituro during my time in Kenya. It was a small little village with about a population of 200 people. And there was a mountain about 3 miles away from us called Mount Morop. And there was a permanent cross. Some priest who had preceded me there had erected this huge, big, it was like 30-foot high cross, and it could be seen from all around the area. But every Good Friday, the entire village would turn out and we would go on procession carrying another cross. And different people would take the chances at carrying the cross. So everybody got a chance until we got up to the top of the mountain. And they'd be singing hymns and we do readings of various kinds. And I remember one particular year, we have just arrived at the top of Mount Morop and we're about to kind of finish the sermons of Good Friday. And all of a sudden somebody shouts out, nyoka, nyoka, nyoka. Nyoka in Swahili means a snake. And there were lots of very vicious snakes in the area, really, really bad ones. So it felt like it was like a Judas moment. And there are only 2 words in Swahili that will activate an entire village. The first one is nyoka, a snake, and the second one is mwizi, a thief. And if you shout nyoka or shout mwizi, the entire village will turn out to kill the snake or to hunt down the thief. So they're all shouting nyoka, 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 and they're pelting him with stones. And it felt like we were finally doing it to Satan himself. We felt like St. Patrick banishing the snakes out of Ireland, or like Yahweh having words with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So it was a really powerful conclusion on that particular year to the Good Friday ceremonies. Now, when I go back to the scriptural accounts of Good Friday, Jesus is subjected to 4 different trials. Firstly, late at night on the Thursday night, he's brought before the high priest and he's accused of blasphemy because he's been heard to call God his Father. To use even a very, very close term like Abon, he'd be speaking in Aramaic. Abon is kind of the birthing principle of the cosmos, or in Hebrew, Abba, daddy, that he's using daddy of God. And this was total blasphemy as far as the kind of high priests were concerned. So that's the first trial. Then they send him off to Pilate. And there's this philosophical discussion, where Christ says to Pilate, anybody who's interested in the truth will listen to my voice. And Pilate very snidely says, what is truth? And actually, that was the title I gave to my first book, The first book I wrote was in Swahili, and I called it Ukweli ni Nini, what is truth, or what does truth mean? So Pilate is not impressed, but he hears in the course of the interrogation that Jesus is actually from Galilee. And Pilate didn't have jurisdiction in Galilee. It was Herod who had jurisdiction. And Herod was in Jerusalem for the feast day. So he sent Jesus off to Herod. Let Herod deal with this mishigas. So Jesus comes before Herod. And Herod has heard about this Jesus character, whom he regards as a magician. And he's hoping to have entertainment. And so he interrogates Jesus. He's waiting for him to walk across a swimming pool. And Herod is the only character in the scriptures with whom Jesus refuses to exchange even a single word. He refuses completely to respond. He only has hours left in his life. He's not going to waste it talking to this buffoon who wants to be entertained. And so Herod treats him as a fool and sends him back down to Pilate. And we learn that day Pilate and Herod became friends again because there'd been bad feeling between them. And that leads us then to the final scene where Jesus is on the cross, crucified on the cross. Now, when you read through the gospel accounts, allegedly there are 7 different last utterances of Jesus on the cross. And not all of them are contained in each of the scriptures. So between the 4 gospels, you can put them together. Some of them are repeated. But I like to rearrange them in what I think was the chronology of what happened to Jesus actually on the cross. So for me, it is a blueprint. The last 3 hours of Jesus' life are a blueprint for the evolution of compassion, from focus on his own suffering, to his family's suffering, to the criminals beside him, to those who will persecute him, to completeness of the mission, and then return to source. So the first one we find is in John's Gospel, where Jesus says, I am thirsty. And so this is a kind of a symbolic articulation of the fact that he's in extraordinary agony. A crucifixion is possibly the most vicious form of execution that has ever been created. And it wasn't created by the Romans, it was created by the Persians, but it was used by the Romans and others as well. So the phrase, I thirst, doesn't just represent, I'm parched, give me a drink already. It's about the fact that I'm literally in agony. My entire body is screaming out in pain. So the first words have to do with focus on his own personal suffering physiologically. Then the second one, where he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you abandoned me? And now it's gone from physiological pain to mental torment, where he believes that even God has forsaken, that there's no respite whatsoever. So now the first 2, they're focused on himself, his physiology, his physical body, and now his mental suffering. Then he transcends that, and he's watching his mother and his companion Mary of Magdala and John the Beloved at a distance. They wouldn't be allowed to be actually right next to the cross, so he sees them from a distance. And now he's beginning to imagine, what is it like for them to watch this happening? And what is it going to be like for them, after I've died? And now his focus is no longer on himself and his suffering. His focus is on the suffering of those whom he really, really loves. And so he wants to make sure that they take care of each other. And so nodding towards his mother, he says, woman, behold your son, nodding to John. And then to John, he says, son, behold your mother. Look out for each other. And indeed, according to the tradition, that's exactly what John the Beloved did. He did. He looked after Mary for the rest of her life. So that's the third phase. The fourth one is, we are told that one of the thieves that was crucified beside him was vilifying him and shouting out, if you are the Messiah, get down off the cross and take us down with you. He's screaming in his own agony. Now, according to this, one of the thieves said, don't you realize we're dying because we deserve to die? But this man is totally innocent. And he says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And then Christ focuses not even on his family, but on a fellow sufferer. And he says to him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. And so now his focus is on the fellow sufferer. And then he looks down at the foot of the cross, and you have the soldiers below mocking him and tearing up his garments, to parcel them out. And he looks down at them, and then turning to the Father, he says, Abba, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. So neither the soldiers who were vilifying him, nor the crowds at a distance who were chanting, they have no idea what they're doing. Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. So now his focus is on the persecutors of various kinds. The sixth one then is finally, he's ready to let go. And he says, it is accomplished, it's finished. I've done what I volunteered to do. So at that stage, he can say, you know, he didn't miss a beat. Even in the temptations, he still accepted the mission that he had agreed to before he came in. And then the final one, this really beautiful line where he says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And for me, it wasn't just, you know, Daddy, you know, I'm letting go now. It was, Abba, hug me, I'm finished. So that for me is like the words that he spoke on the cross. There's one final piece that I really love. You know, there's not a whole lot about the creedal formulations that I like a lot, but there's this one phrase in the Apostles' Creed, which comes from the 3rd century, where that says, after he had died, Jesus descended into hell. Now, what in God's name does that mean? That he descended into hell. And for me, it's that Jesus wanted to personally experience the darkest, deepest, densest separation from source that it is possible to experience. So he had to go into the darkest depths in order to shine the light, so that even beings who reside there through their own kind of darkness and their own lack of faith in the light, he wants to go down there and shine the light even there. So he wants to infuse even that dark dungeon place with the light of Christ consciousness. He's looking at those souls, to use kind of Hindu mythology. He's looking at those lost souls in the astral realm who are stuck in earth kind of ambiguities. I would say finally then that there is no darkness that the light of God cannot penetrate. There is no soul that God's love cannot touch. There is no mindset which Christ consciousness cannot elevate. So for me, Transfiguration, Palm Sunday, Holy Thursday, and Good Friday, they're not just stages in Jesus' life, they're stages in your life as well. To experience resurrection, you have to experience the other stages as well. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.